suddenly fell off its hinges. It landed with a thud on the front porch. Luckily, Kase and Murdox were able to scramble out of the way before it could squash them.
"Oh, dear me, I am so terribly sorry," said Mrs. Willoughby. "Those troublesome little monsters must have pulled the pins right out of the hinges."
Kase and Murdox quickly regained their composure and stepped over the fallen door. Kase glanced quickly around the house, and Murdox stuck his snout in the air and took a couple of sniffs. They muttered to themselves disapprovingly, but it was Kase who spoke first. "Not to worry, ma'am. We've had to deal with nixies before. A terrible lot they are. Tell me, Mrs. Willoughby, how did you get mixed up with them?" Suddenly, a stink bomb exploded in the middle of the living room with a boom, and a ghastly green cloud billowed towards them. Mrs. Willoughby moved very rapidly for her age. Covering her nose, she followed close behind Kase and Murdox as they dove off the stairs onto the ruined lawn. Mrs. Willoughby waved her hand towards her little front yard and began to whimper. "It's all my fault. All I wanted to do was to conjure up some garden gnomes to help me tidy my roses." Murdox and Kase stood by patiently as she spoke. They were not as interested in what she was saying as they were in allowing time for the air to clear. "The annual Wizard's Day parade is coming up, you know, and I wanted my little garden to look its best." She sighed deeply and then continued. "I gathered up all the proper ingredients for the gnome casserole. I prepared the spell and baked it in the oven at 450 degrees, just like the recipe calls for. But Miss Tilly, you know old Miss Tilly, don't you? She stopped by to share a cup of tea and some really juicy tidbits of news about the Reverend Hartgood. Well, we lost all track of time, and I guess I cooked the little fellows too long." Kase nodded to her supportively as he dragged off his brown leather backpack with the IEA logo displayed on its front pouch. He unzipped the bag and reached inside. After a short search, he pulled out a large leather-bound book entitled The Joy of Conjuring, 3rd edition. He quickly shuffled through the pages to the chapter called Gnome Incantations Made Easy. Kase skimmed through the spell and then shook his head as he reached the helpful hints section. After a brief consultation with Murdox, he turned to the section on nixies and scanned the incantation. Kase then asked Mrs. Willoughby where she had purchased the ingredients, particularly the imp brains. Mrs. Willoughby turned an unflattering shade of red and looked around sheepishly.
Well, the Wizard's Market was, all sold out of fresh imp brains, so I went to the regular grocers and picked up the canned variety."
Kase glanced at Murdox, who curled his lip. "Do you happen to remember which brand you purchased, Mrs. Willoughby?" Mrs. Willoughby stared at Kase with a worried look in her eyes, trying to recall.
I believe I chose Blue Ogre brains. Yes, I'm sure of it. It was definitely the Blue Ogre brand."
"Well, that explains it. My reference book cautions against using certain varieties of canned brains because some manufacturers pickle them for a longer shelf life. Blue Ogre just happens to be at the top of the list." Mrs. Willoughby paled until she looked downright ghostly.
"Oh, I must have conjured up those little guys 100 times before. I hardly look at the recipe anymore. Dear me, I never even realized."
"Not to worry, Mrs. Willoughby. We see these kinds of errors happen all the time." Kase cleared his throat and nudged Murdox, who was rolling his eyes and snorting. Kase gave Murdox a stern glance. "Unfortunately, overcooked pickled imp brains are a perfect recipe for disaster, and in this case, they transformed your gnomes into nixies." The young agent dropped The Joy of Conjuring, 3rd edition, back into his backpack. "Not to worry," he assured her. "We've come prepared." Kase dug around in his backpack again. After pulling out and setting aside a billfold, a set of car keys, a television remote control, and a pair of old socks, he continued searching until finally he came up with a gigantic mayonnaise jar. This was no ordinary mayonnaise jar. Instead of being filled with mayonnaise, it was packed full of small forms suspended in a glowing, gelatin-like goo. It almost looked like something you might eat at a school cafeteria, except that those weren't suspended fruit pieces. These chunks were very irate little blue creatures. Setting the mayonnaise jar to the side, Kase reached back into his pack again and pulled out and then replaced several odd-looking contraptions in succession and muttered to himself for a while. Finally, he located a small ream of flypaper wrapped tightly in yellow plastic. He looked up to see Mrs. Willoughby staring at the mayonnaise jar. "I have no idea how it works myself," Kase told her. "The instruction book says something about a quantum compressor shifting the multi-dimensional time-space continuum. All I know is that you can keep stuffing the little creeps into the jar, and they'll just shrink to fit." With a smile and a flourish, Kase held up the jar so she could get a better look. The label read, "Jellied Nixies." "This is where we are going to put your problem, Mrs. Willoughby." Mrs. Willoughby looked very impressed. Murdox just looked as if he were going to spit up a hairball, if dogs could have hairballs. "This is how it's going to play out." Kase proceeded to explain to the others what seemed to be a hastily improvised but workable plan. Kase and Murdox then left Mrs. Willoughby safe in the front yard while they gathered up their supplies and tiptoed back into the devastated house. Kase carefully unwrapped the yellow plastic around the ream of flypaper. He peeled one sheet of very sticky paper from the roll and looked for a good place to set his trap. He spotted the coffee table, still covered with the splattered remains of Mrs. Willoughby and Mrs. Tilly's afternoon tea. Kase dragged the coffee table into the middle of the living room and placed the flypaper on top of it. With great care, Murdox dropped Kase's keys on top of the sticky paper. Then the investigators slipped behind the couch and waited for their quarry. They didn't have to wait very long. They heard a thunderous howl, followed by some seriously foul language. Kase started to get up from behind the couch, but Murdox quickly grabbed his shirt tail and pulled him back down.
"Take it easy, Trigger. Remember that nixies are stupid. And by that, I mean really, really stupid. If we wait just a bit longer..."
"Jinx, Frigglesby! Yellow fry!"
Another nixie had been captured in the flypaper and was blurting out a series of words that would get a kid grounded for life. Murdoch sniffed the air. "Okay, now we can check it out." When they poked their heads up over the couch, they saw two little blue-skinned creatures fighting over a set of car keys as they tangled themselves in the sticky paper. Kase looked at Murdox and gestured with his lips in an expression that said, "Hey, I'm impressed." Murdox grunted. "Yes, the plan is working. I've done this before too, you know. I may be a wolf dog now, but keep in mind that I was a wizard before this." Kase studied the pointy ears, the furry tail, and the drooling tongue. It was often hard to remember that Murdox had once had another form. As Murdox had read to him on their way there, the great big anthology of annoying creatures defined nixies as creatures between 1.5 and 2 feet tall, having large pointed ears, big yellow eyes, and ropey mottled hair that grows in every conceivable color and direction. It continued. Most commonly, their skin appears as various shades of blue, but it may range to a deep purple. Nixies are usually seen dressed in shabby bits of rags or other trappings that they have swiped from whomever they are currently tormenting. They are dim-witted creatures with an insatiable appetite for thieving and causing mayhem. Nixies are notorious for being at the center of trouble. Though it has never been proven, it's generally believed that they were the cause of the green-out of 29, a tumultuous period in history when everything turned...